Nestled on the shore of Douglas Lake in the far northern reaches of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, the University of Michigan Biological Station looks more like a rural village than a high-tech research station. But this outpost has a 100-year legacy of ecological research that BioStation Director Newt Nadelhofer clearly embraces. Professor Nadelhofer, tell me about the history of this facility.
The history began in 1909 during the first year of operations. Professors Reichert and Burns came up from the U of M with 20 or so students and taught a biology and a zoology class right on this shore. And those students, of course, came up. Some of them were grad students, some of them were teachers, some of them were undergrads at U of M, and they right away started doing research. 100 years ago, if you looked at this landscape, you would see very few trees, you'd see charred stumps. So those students were looking at the recovery from a large disturbance that involved logging and fires. When we bring students up here, they're in small classes, they are in the field doing research. In the morning, they're often doing lecture. In the afternoon, they're in the field. And in the evening, they're analyzing their data. We've been doing that for 100 years.
So that brings up two things. First of all, you are building on a lot of research. You have a library of research that was done on this location. How does that help propel students now? They have that whole edifice to build on.
Exactly. And so our students today have the opportunity to look back and see what the environment looked like 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. Use that information together with theirs to look forward and see what the environment might look like in a decade, in 50 years.
That bank of research data spanning 100 years is incalculably valuable to research scientists who come to the biostation seeking to understand processes which are affecting our entire planet. Principal among them, the carbon cycle.
One of the things that organizes our research is the carbon cycle. Middle-aged forests like this in North America, Europe, and Asia are actually removing much more carbon from the atmosphere than they're respiring back.
Okay.
What these forests are doing in aggregate is removing about 1/4 of all human-caused carbon dioxide emissions.
Wow.
This is where we have our instruments.
Okay.
We have our instruments hung at the very top.
Okay.
It's a 110-foot tower, and I need to go up there to change a filter.
Okay, and is that filter collecting data somehow, or collecting something you'll analyze?
The filter is just to clean the air that
Okay.
is pulled down from the top of the tower. We have an instrument that measures the carbon dioxide concentration. We have other measurements that allow us, all put together, measure the flux or the amount of carbon dioxide that's coming into this forest.
What is at the top of the tower is an infrared gas analyzer. Now what that does is measures the concentration of CO2 above the forest. It measures it 10 times per second. So Chris has to keep this tube clear of all obstructions because it's sending gas down really fast to that instrument. So we know in any given second what the concentration is of CO2 in the atmosphere. Chris and researchers from Ohio State, Michigan, other institutions actually work together to measure the turbulence above the canopy. So at any given time by that sensor, air masses are either moving down or moving up. He also has instruments that measure that turbulence, measure the wind direction and speed in 3 dimensions. So at the same time that CO2 is being measured 10 times per second, the wind speed and wind direction are being measured at 10 times per second.
With all the precise measurements being taken of carbon dioxide emission and absorption by the forest, research scientists should be able to accurately predict how much man-made carbon dioxide the forest can absorb in the future, except that the trees themselves are in a state of transition.
By about the turn of the century, this land had been cut over and burned. Here's an evidence of the scorching. See that white pine stump?
Oh yeah.
There's fire charcoal on the outside of it.
So after the logging and the burning, first thing to come in is the aspen. So what we're having is kind of that first wave of aspen is nearing the end of its life cycle. Correct?
That's right.
So when you talk about predicting where this is going in the future, you have the FACET project that is trying to hasten that prediction. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. The FACET project, FACET stands for Forest Accelerated Succession Experiment.
Okay.
So succession is the natural replacement of early colonizing species with later colonizing species. We want to know when those later successional species dominate the forest, whether the forest will remove as much carbon as it is now and has during the past decade or so.
And you're hastening that process by doing this process you called girdling. And I know that's not putting a corset on the trees. What is that exactly?
That's cutting a thin ribbon of bark around the base of the tree, basically making a cut with a chainsaw only about maybe an inch deep and stripping off all the outer and inner bark. So the roots slowly die. Within about 2 to a maximum of 3 years, all the aspen in the forest that we're studying will be dead. And that's about 40% of the trees, 40% of the leaves. Now, when you pull that back, you hook it in here.
All right. This view is incredible. Once you get over the canopy,
Yeah,
you can just see for miles.
yeah. If you look under the canopy, and if these aspen leaves had fallen, you can see all the russets and the reds. Those are the oaks and the maples. When the aspen die, either naturally or because of the facet experiment, those trees will grow faster. They'll exploit the area that's left unshaded after the aspen dies, so we think we'll have a more complex interleaved canopy of species that are actually able to photosynthesize both in direct sunlight and in relative shade. Our hypothesis is that while the aspen are dying, the forest will take up less CO2, but as the maples and oaks and pines extend their branches out and up, they're going to expose their leaves to more sunlight. And the canopy will be more complexly layered, and we think photosynthesis will increase. That's
So in
only
other
our
words,
working hypothesis.
The working
however.
hypothesis, though, is that in the natural cycle of this, as you have less of these first arriving birch
Right.
and aspen, you're actually going to have greater carbon uptake.
That's one of our hypotheses. And the idea is then to build conceptual and computer models of forests that can actually have some predictive power, and we can test those models with the results of the measurements we make both here and in the experimental area.
The study of the forest's ability to absorb carbon is not limited to the trees. Research scientists at the biological station are also closely examining the ground. But to talk to them, well, first you have to find them.
Hey, Jim! Yeah? Hey, we're over by plot 6, no inputs. You want to come over? Yeah. Okay, thanks.
So is that your walkie-talkie system right there?
That's our walkie-talkie system, right?
With an array of ground plot experiments, the biostation's forest soil study analyzes the incorporation of carbon and nutrients into the soil.
After the oceans, when you come up on land, if you want to know where the bulk of the carbon is, you look to the soils.
Okay, I see. So the trees take it out of the air and put it into the soil.
Exactly. And what this experiment is doing is trying to suss out how much of that soil carbon is coming from the leaves versus coming from the roots.
We've explored the role that trees play in the carbon cycle, and we've learned that the ground absorbs carbon from their roots. But doctoral student Jasmine Crumsey is examining how one little creature impacts the dirt's ability to hold carbon.
What I'm interested in is how invasive earthworms impact the amount of carbon that forests can store.
Invasive earthworms.
True.
I've been digging up earthworms since I was a kid.
Right.
They weren't normally here?
No, all of the northern U.S. and northern Europe was covered by glaciers about 13,000 years ago. And so during that time, earthworms were actually removed from our forests. What we think is that due to European settlement and the beginning of agriculture, you started getting the introduction of earthworms.
So they do really good things on agricultural plots, but they don't understand plot lines or property. So they just go right into the forest, and what happens there?
So now you have, in forests where there were no earthworms, you have increases in the rate at which the leaves that are on the ground disappear. You increase how much water can get in, and what we're asking is whether or not you increase how much carbon is stored in forest soil. So we can think of the soil as a bank. And what we want to understand is that if you have these exotic species that are now here that weren't here before, do you change the amount of carbon that's in that bank, how long carbon stays in that bank?
You're doing this very fine research, or detailed research, about earthworms. How do you observe them? I mean, they're underground, we're above ground. What do you do?
True. To actually look at what their densities are and also look at what species are there, we use this electroshocking technique, which doesn't harm them at all.
Yeah, okay.
But we think it's basically what happens is that you run a current through the soil and they respond to that and come up to the surface. We think it's an escape response to predators. There's one right here that you can get. It's basically a non-invasive technique that we use out here. Instead of digging holes or putting mustard seed solution on the ground, what it allows us to do is to come back to sites over and over and over again, basically, and use the same sampling technique.
Things trending in any direction? What do you think the outcomes are going to be?
So in general, what we think is that earthworms are going to decrease the amount of carbon that can be stored in soils, but what we're seeing so far is that it really does depend on what species that are there and what their function is in the soil.
Conducting research at the biostation enables Jasmine to establish precise soil data, but perhaps what she values most is her collaboration with other scientists, and in particular, her advisor, Newt Nadelhofer.
What I liked about him when I first met him is that he really is interested not only in science, but in policy and outreach and education.
We can't do it alone, of course. What we can provide is scientific understanding of what's happening to ecosystems like forests, like lakes and wetlands, but we need to be talking with economists and policymakers.